welcome back to the show. Boy was frozen for a little bit.
There you go.
Haley Miller from Digital Power Network. Thank you for coming on. We had met at Bitcoin Vegas with Cody Carbone, who was an early podcast guest with Avi and I. So always a fun guy to run into at conferences and talk to. So first, Haley, welcome and good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. I guess good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Joe's he's on the West Coast.
Okay.
We're in New York, where it is now the afternoon. So
okay, I was like, I think it's 1:45, but that makes sense.
It's always morning over here. So tell us a little bit about like what you're doing, because you just got a promotion. Like let's get a little round of applause.
Oh,
a couple months ago, since we last spoke, you got executive director title.
I did.
That's our audience in the background clapping.
Oh, I love it.
But for those that don't know you, I think if you can just give a quick background. I think Cody's done a great job of being out there. With what they're doing in DC. You work closely with Cody. Would love to hear your background and what you're doing today, and then definitely want to talk about policy, because I think number one, the Clarity Act, for those that are not in the know, it's the lack of Clarity Act, right? And so I'd love to dive into that. We're going to be talking about like data centers. There's a moratorium going on right here in New York, which is crazy given all the AI stuff with Bitcoin as well, and other policies that are happening behind closed doors that you're going to give us a little insight into, hopefully today. But give a quick background if you could.
Yeah, I guess a little bit about me. I'm Haley Miller. I'm the executive director of the Digital Power Network. For those who don't know, the Digital Power Network is the largest and leading coalition of Bitcoin miners and digital infrastructure developers in the United States. We represent over 85% of the public US Bitcoin hash rate, and we promote policies for industry that range from everything from energy and the grid to tax, trade, really, you name it, we do it. We're part of the larger trade association, the Digital Chamber, which is the largest trade association for digital assets and blockchain technology.
Love it. So tell us a little bit about, I know some of the education early on, and if you're speaking to people outside of Bitcoin in the industry, is Bitcoin miners versus HPC, high performance compute. Tell us a little bit about how you explain that, and explain like on 5 terms what these two industries and the 2 implementations of data centers do.
Oh, that's my favorite way to explain things, because I think if we've learned one thing in this industry, there's a lot of acronyms that you may or may not have ever heard of, and you may never hear again. It's hard to keep up. There's been a lot of education on this front. I think a lot of folks are still trying to understand, what is AI and what is a data center? What is Bitcoin? But I think one of the things where we've had a lot of success in really being able to differentiate that for folks is just really understanding, I would say, the differences in kind of the energy aspect of things. I think one of the best ways, and one of the issues that we really run into a lot with lawmakers, is really being able to differentiate the difference of the large load. So we like to discuss it as, and this is again throwing out some more words, the kind of integrative load versus extractive load. You think of kind of traditional AI and data centers as once they turn on, they're operating, at a very high capacity, and they remain on for essentially kind of the lifetime of the project. The best way to describe the difference between the energy use of Bitcoin is that Bitcoin miners are able to turn on, power on, and then actually when the grid is stressed or under kind of peak demand, grid operators will actually send a signal to the miners, which then they will then curtail their operations, lowering their usage and pushing that power back out to the grid. So thinking of it as Bitcoin miners are really in that kind of integration of the grid. They're responding in real time, and they're kind of ebbing and flowing as the needs of the grid change. Bitcoin miners or, data centers are going to be a little bit more on the extractive side, where they necessarily pull from the grid and don't necessarily push energy back.
And right before we hopped on, I don't know how much you're able to share there, but we had it as one of the topics with the moratorium going on with some of these data centers in New York. So New York's notoriously been very tough. We came from a custodian. It was very hard to get your BIT license, right? I didn't know this was going on now with the data centers themselves, especially as we were just saying AI, as we talked about the last episode. they're popping up everywhere. NBIS, DBS is a company. They're building one in New Jersey. So New Jersey seems like they don't have that issue as well. Curious what's happening from what you can share. Why is there pushback? It feels like New York wants to get new people coming in for AI. Like what is their pushback in general? What is your guys' counter to that? How does this all play out?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of action going on in New York. And I think if we look back and remember in 2022, New York was a state that actually passed a Bitcoin mining moratorium. So moratoriums are not new and they're not unheard of. The Bitcoin mining moratorium did pass and operations did cease. So when we see legislation, being introduced in New York, you have to take it very seriously. And I would say there's two big bills that have been introduced pretty recently that relate to not only, AI and data centers, but also Bitcoin miners. And that's going to be, there was a moratorium imposed. I think this was maybe 4 or 5 days ago now. This is very, very recent. That would actually impose a 3-year moratorium to all, data center operators, anyone who's hoping to do business in New York. And that's a minimum of 3 years. So this also doesn't matter, where you are in the permitting process. If you're at the beginning, you're at the end, anywhere in the middle, your operations will cease for a minimum of 3 years. And the viability of projects after a cease of operation of that length is, it's really untenable. It's not really an option for any of these companies. So a moratorium would essentially cease the creation of any new infrastructure in this sector in New York. So there's a lot of concerns around there. There's also, a couple other pieces of legislation that, impact the industry, if passed. But I think the moratorium is going to be the one that folks are most concerned about. I was just in Albany the last couple of days, and we spoke with lawmakers, on both the Assembly and the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, you name it. I think a lot of folks are in agreement that a moratorium is not the way to proceed. New York Governor Hochul has made it very clear that she wants New York to be a place for AI to prosper and to continue to grow. I think she said it, just a few weeks ago in her State of the State. But, there's one way to allow the industry to not grow and to not prosper is to halt it and send it elsewhere. So I think this legislation is going to be top of mind. We've heard from a handful of lawmakers that a moratorium of this nature is just out of the question and non-starter in negotiation. So I think we're very, very excited to hear that. I would say those who are proposing the moratorium are coming at it from, I would say, a lack of knowledge. They are concerned on the environmental implications of the industry, but not necessarily taking the actual facts into consideration as to what the environmental implications are. So there's a really big, I think, misunderstanding of what, even what data centers are and they do and what their environmental impacts actually are. So we try to push a lot of education on that front. I think we've been very successful, changing hearts and minds. We're not going to give up. We were there for 2 days. I think we met with 20 different lawmakers, but we still got more to go, and continuing to raise awareness on this issue and kind of spread the narrative of the actual, the facts and information, not being pushed into bad legislation just because the headlines sound scary.
Quick follow up on that. Is this something? Is Governor Hochul, is she saying something in public, or is she able to veto this if she's saying this in public that she wants it to be a place? I don't know how it works, in your world here, but is this something she can say, no, put the hammer down and veto this, or is this
she can say anything. I think, a statement from her on this exact bill and this idea would be a great point for her. She's made it very clear that she wants AI to continue to flourish in the state and for New York to really be a central hub for the industry. So I think her making a statement on, that a moratorium is not the correct way to go would go a long way. We're still very far off from, the need for a veto, for example. This bill has just been introduced. It necessarily hasn't picked up traction yet. But I think, one thing we always have to be aware of is, legislation can move very, very fast. And it's very concerning when it moves fast and no one necessarily understands the ramifications or the impact that it would have. So anytime a piece of legislation, especially something as significant as a moratorium across a major industry for countless years we need to stop, recognize what the impact is, and kind of continue to raise awareness before it does get out of hand and would, for example, start moving very quickly, which it always could.
Yeah, I think when you see like in the last week or 2 weeks, you had Anthropic rolled out a new release of Claude, both on like Opus 4.6, and look really focused on the coding side, but then also the legal side and capabilities there. And once that was released on the legal side, Thomson Reuters stock dropped 10%, I believe, in one day. And a lot of these like SaaS companies have really felt the pain because people are coming around to like how many jobs are really going to be disrupted by that. And many ways, the only way you can play it, you can't always invest in OpenAI, private placement, or Anthropic, which are private companies. So you really have to bet on these like hyperscalers, like the Googles, Meta, Amazon, and these companies that are building data centers, and some of the people that you work with as well that are investing in the actual physical infrastructure. And to miss that completely because you want to wait and see and figure that out, it's like, okay, well, it's a K-shaped economy, and it has been since COVID. And so do you want to be on the upper end of the K-shaped economy, or do you want to be in moratorium, just waiting and seeing and not seeing any growth for like your constituents? So concerning if you live in New York, but hopefully you guys get it pushed through and convince them.
Say it is concerning, but we're going to advocate tirelessly to push back on the moratorium. We look at every piece of legislation that would impact the industry very closely, and if there's an issue that needs to be solved and we need to be loud, that's what we're here for.
Mm-hmm. Moving over to with DC, talking a little bit more about the Clarity Act. The headlines were Brian Armstrong went in there and basically said, this is no good. We got to go back to the drawing board. And that's about how far I dove in. I tried to read through it. I should have had Claude like analyze it for me. But since we have you here today, what you can share about just overall for people that are unaware of what the Clarity Act is doing, focus more on stable coins than necessarily Bitcoin. But it is one of the bigger, after Genius Act, this has been in the headlines quite a bit. So where are we at with that? What is it, first of all? And where are we at? And what is your, we're not going to fact check you on your predictions here, but what do you think that's going to lay out ultimately?
So there's a lot going on. I think negotiations continue, by the day. I mean, even by the hour and the minute. I think we're close to getting, something done, coming to an agreement on both sides. There's a lot of different issues with a lot of split ideas on, different subsets of the industry and kind of different subsets of the sector that are in discussion right now. I like to think of what Clarity is. Clarity is market structure. It's, necessarily the rules for the road for a lot of these different, counterparts of the industry to be able to operate in really a clear, kind of sound path. It doesn't necessarily affect, I would say Bitcoin or the Bitcoin miner specifically. I think the issues relate a little bit more heavily into kind of the stablecoin side of the debate. And I think that's where we see a lot of discussion now. But I think we're going to come to, all sides are going to come to an agreement at some point. Again, hopefully it's sooner than later. We are, it is February 11th. We're almost at Valentine's Day. And every day that we get closer to midterms, we're going to start to see a little bit less legislating happening as, kind of focus shifts elsewhere. So they've got a lot to do, and hopefully we start to see some action in the next coming days and hopefully weeks.
Yeah, because when I did do the research here, it said that yesterday, I think it was, they had the second meeting on stablecoin yields. I know you've been up in Albany, so maybe you're not as close to what happened as of yesterday, but it shows that banks are calling for like total prohibition, a total ban, on stablecoins. And Patrick Witt is set on March 1st with the deadline for the compromise. So as you said, we're 19 days away, roughly. So is this feasible? I know the governments tend to move slower than, private businesses here, but
I think anytime you have a deadline or a goal, things will always move a little bit faster. I think having kind of an open-ended timetable is going to what would be essentially hurting negotiations. But if we've got a deadline of March 1st and we've got both sides at the table talking, which is what matters. So I think everyone can get there. We just need to, keep conversations going and come to an agreement.
So this is off the cuff kind of point, but we've seen in the last like couple years, and we're like obviously we're like a Bitcoin live stream, so we're coming from like a certain area of people and thought process. So where we stand now is people are calling Europe and their current, economic situation. They're like, you guys went heavily on ESG, and then now you're completely dependent. Even when we like sanction Russia, completely dependent on their natural gas and resources. And we saw them have to make like tough decisions during that time that Russia invaded Ukraine. And then China, on the other hand, has been able to steamroll ahead, and their economy's growing. They're competitive with AI. They have some hiccups certainly with their like real estate markets, but they've been able to like get around those bumps and continue to push and grow their economies. And so now, not consensus in like the Bitcoin community, but I think many pushed back on some of the ESG measures early on, and then now they're not doing a celebration, but they're saying, hey, we were right. China didn't do any ESG, so anything that Europe stopped producing like coal plants and like stopped with nuclear power plant build outs, like whatever China is doing is totally outweighing any positive environmental impacts they've had. Is this like an argument, or is this something that like even a sliver of this argument, something that you guys use to frame what you're pushing internally, or pushing not internally, but pushing in New York to say, hey, like here's the current feeling from the American public on ESG? Or how does, these major geopolitical countries doing different strategies affect how you frame your arguments?
I would say that we look, really at not only what's happening in the United States, but what, countries across the world are doing. And I think it's something that we take into consideration as we look at, is the US going down the right path? Are competitors pulling ahead? Does the US need to pull ahead, and kind of what that's going to look like? I think as we continue to see, action in the space in China, for example, I think it kind of brings back the importance and kind of the push that we've seen for, the onshoring of additional manufacturing here in the US. I think we're continuing to be at a disadvantage, and that's why we've seen, executive orders to really kind of take steps in this area to continue to bring American manufacturing back on shore, to kind of ramp up production, because it's necessary that, not only we ramp up production in the United States, but for example, for Bitcoin, being able to have, the US public hash rate continue to grow and grow in the United States, and kind of keep that in the United States. I think it would be really important.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be right back. We're going to take a quick break. We are a Bitcoin show, and want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Arch. So we can take a quick 30-second break, because if you are a Bitcoiner, you did the hard part. You stacked, you held, you never panic sold. But as we know, real life still happens. Taxes, new opportunities, big purchases, and selling Bitcoin just feels wrong. And that's where Arch comes in. Arch lets you borrow against your Bitcoin instead of selling it. You borrow what you need, repay anytime, only pay the interest on what you use, all without triggering a tax event. The best part, Bitcoin stays yours. So check out archlending.com/dailystack. All right, we are back. I do want to touch on coming back into Bitcoin. As we've seen with like Iron is one that's big in the news, but like as you're dealing with some of this, and the government's pushing back maybe more so on Bitcoin than AI, just with, Googles of the world, Amazons of the world kind of on their side, maybe. Do you think any of this shift it has to do with that, or they're viewing the government, or is it more, there's not a lot of Bitcoin left, they have to pivot in either way? How much of it is government focus on, making Bitcoin the bad guys essentially, and versus AI, I guess?
I would say I think it really depends. I think a lot of companies have taken, I would say, different routes for different reasons. We're seeing, what is now the traditional Bitcoin miner, which it sounds crazy to say traditional Bitcoin miner at this kind of stage in year, but you've got essentially the traditional Bitcoin miner, you've got the traditional kind of AI HPC data center. We're seeing folks who do both. We're seeing folks who, kind of co-locate, I can't speak today, and really kind of doing, different stacks, or kind of set between the two. So I think a lot are interested, and not necessarily being forced one way or the other, but I think it just kind of comes down to business interests. And we're starting to see, almost a diversification of essentially the, use of some of these facilities.
Mm-hmm. I think you're on mute again, Jez.
Oh, all right. On the side, I'm the worst at that. On the side of terminology, anti-growth, that has been something that, people initially push back on, like the VC mindset, Silicon Valley, and then now the term was effective accelerationists. I think was a lot of what Andreessen Horowitz papers and documents and Mark Andreessen blog posts would always talk about, like, let's accelerate, let's grow way out of this. Now you see Scott Bessent in the administration, and they're going to run it hot. They're going to grow their way out of the current, actually this morning, jobs numbers were 135,000 versus projected like 60, 70,000. So they want to run the economy hot. They think that we can potentially cut interest rates and use the more technological revolution of AI. Do you feel like what you're fighting against is anti-growth, and you're on the side of this movement of effective accelerationists and like in the growth side? Is that how we should think about it when we're thinking about, some of these moratorium type policies as being anti-growth?
I think so. I think we're really kind of seeing it from both sides of the table. We're seeing folks who essentially want to, halt everything in this space. And that's obviously going to be anti-growth if we completely, cease operations. But I think we're also seeing, a fairly good push of, pro-growth policies. I know you mentioned, Treasury Secretary Bessent. It kind of brings me back to the idea of the strategic Bitcoin reserve and kind of the advancement of that initiative here in the United States. Just a few weeks ago, he confirmed at the World Economic Forum that the U.S. has, will not be selling any of its seized Bitcoin, which was, a great win. I think the industry was very, glad to hear that. But I think, for example, what we see next is kind of really that growth phase. I mean, stopping the anti-growth policies that are, necessarily popping up, but then how are we going to push pro-growth policies to actually take that step and bring it, into that next phase? So I think the strategic Bitcoin reserve is a good option because we stopped the anti-growth policy of selling the Bitcoin that the U.S. already had. And now, what are we going to do next to really start actually growing that reserve and kind of continuing to push the U.S. into this next phase of, advancement in the space?
Mm-hmm. And it was a couple days ago, Kramer went on TV and said that the U.S. is going to start buying Bitcoin at 60,000. Do you think there's any truth to that? We've seen states now start to do their own little Bitcoin reserves. Do you think President Trump at some point will say, all right, let's put the instead of the cash printers, we'll do the Bitcoin printers and we'll start buying up some Bitcoin? Is that feasible, you think? Is that far out?
Well, I wish that the U.S. was buying while we were at 60,000 to say the least. I think where we are at now is, we've stopped the selling and we're at this next stage of, what's going to come next for the United States. I think there's two things that need to be figured out. One is really the custody of Bitcoin being held by the government, what that's going to look like, what safeguards and procedures are going to be put in place for, the safe and secure custody, of a reserve asset of the United States. And the next is going to be the accumulation stage. I think there's been a lot of conversation on what that's going to look like. I think it's become very clear in the U.S. that the U.S. wants to focus on a budget neutral pathway. How can they, continue to accumulate Bitcoin, for example, but without doing a burden to the taxpayers? I think is going to be a really good focus. And that's actually surprisingly become, I would say one of the holdups here in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, because a lot of folks agree that budget neutral accumulation is the right way to move forward, but they can't decide what that budget neutral way is going to be. I think everyone has kind of a different opinions up there on, whether that's going to be, selling or, kind of rebalancing our current portfolio of reserve assets, bringing gold to a current valuation. I think, there's, kind of different options across the board. But I think the thing that we do need here in the United States is they need to continue to advance the position of the reserve and, understand and set up the guidelines for custody, and then start making advancements when it comes to accumulation. Because, for example, we are at a good time with essentially Bitcoin taking a little bit of a lower stance that the U.S. should be accumulating right now to kind of fund our reserve.
Yeah. Especially like with Fort Knox, if several have called out that it doesn't have all the gold that we think it should, and that
I'd love to see inside.
Yeah, gone through an audit. Last time people seen inside it was when they filmed, is it Goldfinger, the old James Bond movie? Like, You just,
good point, like Trump and Elon Musk were out there. You know, it's kind of, not to bring up Epstein files, but it's very similar. It was like a big news, like, hey, let's look at this. And then this one got swept under the rug, and a lot of people have forgotten, you know, that commentary. But yeah, I mean, like, they should have to prove that we have it. I think the news probably isn't good if they're not digging in further on this, or
if you
allowing
can go into Venezuela and take out like a foreign leader, you can absolutely go to check out like a building that you own, which is Fort Knox, and then just do a quick tally. Like, it's obviously takes a little more time to audit than that, but we have hundreds of thousands of people on the government payroll. I'm sure we could find a few people that could go in and do an audit.
I would think someone's there presently and working, or, you know, guarding Fort Knox that we could see inside.
Well, do you think the U.S. government would, I don't know what they're currently, I should probably know this, but how they're currently doing the custody, and do you see a situation where, you know, they put it into like a Fort Knox environment, right, where it's actually armed guards? I'd imagine, you know, you need to have something like that, or do you think they're going to go with like an Anchorage, or, you know, one of these custodians that are out there today?
I think they could go either way. They could do, you know, one or the other, or a mix of both. I think we'll probably look at something, you know, it essentially will be a digital Fort Knox, but, you know, instead of gold, for, you know, Bitcoin or other kind of reserve assets. So they'll have to work out, I would say, a lot of specifics, whether it's going to be, you know, cold storage, whether if it's going to have, you know, physical guards, for example. Maybe it's, you know, a diversification of location of assets. You know, there could be really a whole host of mechanisms in place. So I think as we continue to see some of the states continue on their own path, you know, for example, for Texas, who I would say has kind of taken the lead on this issue, you know, we're seeing ideas, you know, being floated and kind of understood, maybe necessarily at a smaller level, kind of at the state level for a smaller figure, you know, of Bitcoin, and trying to understand and kind of continue to grow in this space, so we can kind of look to see what's working and kind of take the best from, I would say, a lot of these different proposals and kind of put them all together to do it at the federal level.
Got to share this. So right now, our friends over prediction market built on Bitcoin using Lightning. Go check it out. But Bitcoin below 60K in 2026 has risen today with a recent sell-off. I think we're at 67, roughly 67,200 now. People are still expecting pain, 82%, which is a high figure. One thing I would note about this market is, for all the listeners that are not familiar with trading or using prediction markets, do read all of the fine print. The description in this is the 1 minute candle drops below 60K. We see a ton of flash crashes. October 10th was one of them. So we don't recommend, it's not financial advice, but just be very cautious. Scam wicks happen when somebody drops the price on the market, or some market maker flubs and fat fingers. You do not want that. So keep in mind that. Look for daily candles, look for weekly candles, some kind of close that isn't so, like, driven by scam wicks. We bring this up though to show things are pretty bearish. How is like the sentiment? How is the vibe with your clientele? You know, the vibes, are people scrambling a little bit to make sure they're you know, tightening up all expenses, given that the price is low and they're not sure how long this chop is going to continue? Like, what's been the feeling in conversations?
I think while no one's necessarily excited to see Bitcoin at the level that it is, I don't think necessarily that the industry is panicked. I think, you know, Bitcoin has had, you know, its ups and downs. I think we can all say that. And yes, we are in a little bit of a down cycle, but we're going to go back up again. And I think we kind of all understand that this is, you know, this is just really the way it is.
I do want to kind of wrap some of these questions up around like the Flare Act. That was one that you were, you know, publicly talking about. Can you first state, like, you know, again, in fifth grade terms, what is the Flare Act? And where do we sit currently with that? And, you know, ultimately, where does that go to? Because you know, from an outsider, and we're in Bitcoin space, but, you know, not a lot of people are digging into the bills as much as we probably should be. So I'm curious what that is and the impact ultimately. I think was it Ted Cruz that introduced that back in March.
Yes, that's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm glad you brought it up. I would say it's kind of a passion project area of mine. The Flare Act was introduced by Senator Cruz, and it essentially incentivizes the mitigation of methane emissions towards a value-added product such as Bitcoin mining. So I would say the best way to describe it is in traditional oil and gas in the way of operations, and without getting into too many specifics, gas has to be flared or vented, throughout these pipelines just due to the levels of kind of pressure within the system. And that's, just something that has to occur in some of these, operations. When that gas is, flared or vented throughout daily operations, with these pipelines, it essentially is released into the atmosphere. And there are ways to actually capture that gas, reducing that release of emissions into the atmosphere and actually putting it towards, a value added product such as Bitcoin. So being able to harness, actually, it's a great picture right there, literally gas being flared.
Yeah.
So being able to harness, that energy and put it into an additional, value added product. So not only reducing the methane emissions, but putting it towards something else. So I think it's a really fascinating, item, and a lot of companies in the space have, really moved forward on it, because I think it's something that, three necessarily unlikely folks and kind of sides of the table can agree on it, because it's good for the environment. Environmentalists, anytime we can reduce our methane emissions, I think everyone, kind of perks up on that side of the table. Traditional oil and gas likes it because it's something that they have to do within their operations, so being able to kind of mitigate those effects. And then, the crypto community likes it. Bitcoin miners like it, being able to, take that power and put it towards an additional use. I think it's a fascinating way of kind of showing innovation in the space, and we continue to expand and kind of grow to something not necessarily only helps, a company or, kind of that space, but also it helps, further than that, it helps the environment, it helps, additional folks.
So
Yeah.
who are like the politicians fighting against that? Because that one seems like kind of a no-brainer. It's like recycling. So the environmental folks they can't be bickering too much. I'm assuming there's some people against it, or is this one pretty straightforward that will pass?
I wish it was straightforward and I wish we could pass it, because, it does seem common sense. It does seem like something that we should be advancing. But at the end of the day, there's always someone out there who necessarily thinks in kind of a different, standpoint. I don't necessarily have a name on this one, but I think you also have to remember Congress has a very long list of priorities, and it's always, a game of getting, airtime for the issues that matter. So there's a lot of issues that they're focusing on, and hopefully we'll get to it, sooner than later, because I think it would, makes a real impact and a real difference in a handful of different ways.
Yeah, we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, and people always talk, cars and things that are like very tangible for people make sense, but really methane itself, they say is very harmful, and like even like the cattle industry, and all around the world. You would know better than we do, but like just having a lot of cows produce a lot of gas. These are gassy cows. The same way is like, are you able to like, do you have to go through and educate people on like why methane's bad? Like, is that something you like a level you need to start at to say, hey, first, methane's bad. If you want to do something with it, it's really hard to like build a whole new pipeline. There's not economic incentives to build a pipeline for another usage. This is the only option to make it worth it to go build is a Bitcoin miner. Is like someone go in on site, put a Bitcoin miner, and no piping, no distribution.
No, I think you have to explain, really all aspects and kind of avenues of something like this. I think, the concept of methane mitigation, which, sounds long and confusing, is something that, can be explained, bringing things back down to kind of, more of a granular level. So you're always going to have to explain things, but I think it's a good example of showing, not only kind of ingenuity in this space, but that, Bitcoin mining is not some, big, bad, scary industry that just hurts our environment. Here's a great example of something that it does to help.
I was just looking into this. It's Greenpeace. I'll call them out by name. Greenpeace and Environmental Working Group are against it. They say that it's making oil drilling more profitable. Pasha Mahdavi flagged that this process could allow oil companies to report lower emissions by offloading gas to miners while continuing to drill.
I would say, I think a good point out of that is admitting that it would lower emissions.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's like,
so yes, they would report lower emissions because they've lowered emissions. Yeah. So
a little you will. But Jody, I don't know if you have any more. This has been really enlightening. I mean, we don't often get folks that are actually on the Hill and working, directly with the people that are making this happen. A lot of times we get it third hand from media. Joe, did you have one more?
Yeah, I guess how can our audience get involved? What's the best way to follow you guys or support you guys or companies you work with that they should start paying attention to?
Well, we'd love you to follow us. We're, Digital Power US on Twitter, website's digitalpowernetwork.com. I think the biggest thing that's, helpful for us is raising awareness of these issues. So, retweeting, reposting, getting engaged in the space, when you care about an issue, telling folks you care about it. I think the, best thing we can do is continue to raise the profile around these issues, raise the voices around these issues, and continue to push to make a difference.
Love it. And give Haley a follow. Haley Miller on Twitter. So thanks so much for popping on, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Oh, thanks for having me. Come back anytime.
Yeah. Thank you, Haley.
Exactly.
Thanks.